All right, we're ready for Proverbs 15 and 16 in our study this morning. Working our way through various Proverbs. I'm going to forego details of the review, but you remember the first 9 chapters present to us the concept of wisdom versus folly. The 9th chapter summarizes that, the entirety of that, but telling us that wisdom is this personified as this woman holding out her invitation to come, wherein folly is doing the same thing. And so from chapter 10 on are various miscellaneous proverbs. Some chapters contain more contrast, and we have that in chapter 15. Others are just miscellaneous general proverbs, and that's what we entitle both chapters 15 and 16. So let's get underway, talking about chapter 15. And I call this just simply general proverbs, dealing with various subjects. Not everything in here is a contrast, but there are many contrasts in Proverbs 15. Let's go to our questions first. And so let's get question number 1, 2, and 3. Question number 1. List the verses from chapter 15 that deal with the tongue. What'd you list? Not what you learned. We'll get to that in a moment. Just, if you didn't get an answer to that, you can look on the board. You probably can find the answer. How many verses did you find dealing with the tongue?
I found 1, 2, and 4, 23.
All right. 1, 2, 4, 23, maybe verse 7, maybe verse 26, maybe verse 28. Perhaps you have more. Because you might see an implication of the tongue, or you might not have put one of these. Your answer is not wrong. It's just those are the ones that I saw with reference to the tongue. Let's skip question 2. It deals with chapter 16. Let's go to question number 3. And what do you learn? What lessons or applications do we learn from these 2 chapters about the tongue? This is... All right. What else? That's good. All right. It's not always what you say, it's how you say it. Anything else? All right. Yeah, careful words bring comfort, but harsh words can cause some difficulty. Tim?
You can control the tongue, or your tongue can control you. Because if you don't watch what you're saying, you say stuff out of just kind of without giving it thought. And then the tongue actually controls you instead of controlling your own tongue.
That's right. You end up having to defend yourself constantly. All right. Now, what we're going to do is take each one of these sections. We won't. Some of them we'll spend more time with than others. But I want to hit some high points and just list some things and take them by subject matter. So let's talk about the tongue here for a little bit. Let's start with verse 1. A soft answer turns away wrath, and a harsh word stirs up anger. What do you learn from that about the tongue? All right, we see the power of the tongue. How I respond to someone may have everything to do with how this situation turns out. Does that make sense? So I may answer with a soft answer. Doesn't mean I'm soft as far as compromising the truth, but it's maybe the tone with which I respond. Maybe the words that I choose may turn away wrath, or it may stir up more anger. I had a good friend a number of years ago, he's dead now, who was a master at that. I've seen him in the midst of controversy, public and private controversy, who the harsher someone would be toward him, the softer he would speak. And the softer he would speak and the kinder he would speak, I would see the anger from the other person just kind of melt. Does that make sense? You ever seen that? Versus someone who responds with sharp tones and barbs creates more anger. Does that make sense? That often happens. All right, let's go further. At verse 2, I'm learning, and verse 7, I'll group those together, that our tongue should spread knowledge. We ought to use our tongue to spread knowledge. That would, first of all, imply teaching the Word of God. Look at verse 2. Therefore the tongue of the wise uses knowledge rightly, but the fool pours forth foolishness. Verse 7, the lips of the wise disperse knowledge, but the fool doesn't do so. That's one form of knowledge, but we ought to tell things that are correct. Be careful how we word things, careful what we say, what we repeat. That would include more than just repeating the message of God. Let's look at verse 4. Here's something else I learned about the tongue. I don't have these subdivided out on the screen. But the tongue can heal and can refresh. A wholesome tongue is a tree of life, but perverseness breaks the spirit. What do you learn from that? Let's group verse 26 with that. Same kind of thought. The thoughts of the wicked are an abomination of the Lord, but the words of the pure are pleasant. Yeah. Your words can be refreshing and can encourage and build them up and stir them on. And it makes you feel like you've accomplished something if you spurred someone on. And makes you feel like, hey, I've accomplished something by just saying an encouraging word. And sometimes you don't know how powerful those words are. How powerful those words are. I had a friend who was writing a commentary on the book of Isaiah, and his wife had died and he got discouraged and he just kind of quit on it. And I saw him at a funeral and I just said a word of encouragement. I said, man, if I could take your mind and just lock you in a room, I wouldn't let you out till you finish that commentary. I want you to get that thing done. And later he published it and he said, I published it because of your encouraging word at that funeral. I didn't think anything about what I said. I didn't think I had that much influence. Your encouraging word can spur someone on. Does that make sense? All right. It can be healing and refreshing. Verse 26, verse 4. Look at verse 23. Here's another message about your tongue. A man has joy by the answer of his mouth, and a word spoken in due season, how good it is. Slow this on the latter part of that. Particularly, what a word spoken in due season. Timing is everything. Timing is everything. Both with the good word, the encouraging word, and with maybe the harshness. Timing is everything. What may have been good at another time may not be good right now. This is not the time for that. Eliphaz was bad with that. You remember from the book of Job. What he said was true, but boy, his timing stunk. And so timing has everything to do with that. One more on the tongue. Let's look at verse 28. The heart of the righteous studies how to answer, but the mouth of the wicked pours forth evil. What does that mean? Yeah, think about it before you respond. The righteous person studies how to answer. I don't think that's talking about you study the Word of God so that I can present the truth. That needs to be done. That's true. This is, you think before you speak. You think before you repeat. You think about how you respond. Think of the implication. Think of where that's going to lead. Think of how that comes across before you speak. So if that's as far as we got today and we understood, you know what, sometimes I need a soft answer. I should speak knowledge. What I have to say could be refreshing and encouraging. Timeliness has everything to do with that. And furthermore, I need to think before I speak. Then we've learned a lot. Let's talk about God's all-seeing eye. Yeah, absolutely. That is true. Look at verse 3. Let's talk about God's all-seeing eye. The eyes of the Lord in every place, keeping watch on the good and the evil. Simply, God sees all. He sees good and evil. But now verse 11 is interesting. Hell and destruction are before the Lord. That's Sheol, by the way. That's not Gehenna. Though the same principle would apply. So how much more the hearts of the sons of men? What's the point? Let me ask you this. Let's word it this way. Can you see in Sheol and see who is in Sheol? Can you see that? No. You can't see that. God can see that. And if God can see that, He can also see into the hearts of men. I can't see in your heart. I can't see what you're thinking. I can't see your motive. You can't see my thinking. You can't see my motive. But God sees that, and so this is the all-seeing eye. That's all it's saying, is God has this all-seeing eye. God sees good and evil, and God sees everything. He sees what's in Hades, and He sees what's in your heart. Just a notable thing we need to take heart to. Let's talk about listening versus refusing instruction. Verse 5 talks about if we despise instruction, we're fools. I won't spend much time with that. I'm going to get to another point. If we listen, verse 5, verse 14, 30, and 1 and 32, we're wise. I'm interested in verse 10. Verse 10. Harsh correction is for him who forsakes the way. He who hates reproof will die. What do you learn from that?
Makes me think that the way of the transgressor is hard.
Yeah, we saw that last week. Yeah, the way of the transgressor is hard. The one, correction is grievous. It's not pleasant. None of us like to be corrected. You think back in school when the teacher said, you got this answer wrong, did you say, oh, great, that's exactly what I was hoping? No, you're not excited about that. The same thing when someone tells you, your husband or your wife says, you didn't handle that right. You don't enjoy that. Correction is not pleasant, but it's good for us, and we need to listen to that. Drop down to verse 33. Here's another proverb on listening. Verse 33, the fear of the Lord is the instruction of wisdom, and before honor is humility. What do you learn from that? I see listening and the fear of God tied together, and I see arrows going in both directions. If you listen to instruction, the conclusion must be you fear God. Could you come in the other direction? Sure. If you fear God, you will listen to instruction. Make sense? There's an added note at the end of verse 33, and that is before honor is humility. One of the things that makes people listen to instruction is humility. Pride keeps us from doing that. All right, let's talk about righteousness versus wickedness. Righteousness versus wickedness. Look at verse 6. In the house of the righteous there is much treasure, but the revenue of the wicked is trouble. With the righteous there is much treasure in contrast to trouble. In other words, there's blessings in being righteous. That's all I want us to see here. Verses 8 and 9. The Lord delights in the righteous. The Lord hates wickedness. I won't spend much time with that. I'm going to move on to verse 29 and finish that section. What do you see in verse 29? It simply says, the Lord is far from the wicked, but He hears the prayers of the righteous. Here's a contrast, righteous versus wicked. He's not listening to the wicked, but He hears the prayers of the righteous. That principle is repeated over and over through the Proverbs and in the New Testament and in Psalms, etc. Psalm 34, 1 Peter 3, other passages deal with that same concept. All right, questions or comments thus far? All right, let's move to cheerfulness versus sorrow. Now, these are two interesting proverbs. Look at verse 13. A merry heart makes a cheerful countenance, but by sorrow of heart the spirit is broken. What does that mean? What do you learn? All right, if joy is in your heart, you're going to be cheerful. Yeah, I think that's the emphasis of verse 13, is that it shows in your countenance. Generally, there may be, with the Proverbs, there are exceptions that you say, I know of an exception to that. Yeah, Proverbs 22:6, classic. There are many exceptions to that, but the general rule is still the same. But here's the general rule, that a merry heart makes a cheerful countenance. That usually we can tell by the expression, by the facial expression, the countenance reveals what's going on in the heart. Person looks sad, they're probably sad. If they look happy, they likely are happy. I'm talking about on a continual basis, not on occasional, but on a continual basis. It shows in their countenance. I will come back to verse 13 in a moment. Verse 15, let's get with that in that connection. Verse 15, all the days of the afflicted are evil, but he who is of a merry heart has a continual feast. What do you make of that, particularly the latter phrase? Yeah. I want to come back to that thought and summarize both 13 and 15. Good point. I think at the end of verse 15, but a merry heart has a continual feast. It's the person with a merry heart is like being at a continual a banquet or a feast. You think of the joy of sitting at a banquet or a feast, and you just got an abundance of food and how happy you are. It's just like you have a continual feast if you have a merry heart. Versus the opposite would be true. The person with a sad heart is like they're, have nothing. And so I think both verse 13 and 15 are focusing on what Caleb just mentioned, the attitude toward problems. Our attitude toward problems have everything to do with the outcome. King makes an observation in his commentary on Proverbs that there's an old saying back in the day of the horse and buggy, you don't holler, whoa, in the middle of a mud puddle. You keep moving. So life is going to be traveling along a road, but you're going to hit some mud puddles, and you don't holler, whoa, and stop and camp in the middle of the mud puddle. You keep moving through that. Does that make sense? So are you going to have problems? Oh, sure you are. Are you going to have times that you feel down? Yes. But keep moving through that. And so look at those two proverbs in light of that. A merry heart has a cheerful countenance, and by sorrow of heart the spirit is broken. Verse 15, and all the days of the afflicted are evil, but those who have a merry heart, one who is a merry heart has a continual feast. Attitude makes a big difference. Absolutely. Verse 16 now. Let's talk about true riches versus gain. Verse 16, better is little with the fear of the Lord than great treasure with trouble. What do you learn? Say again. Yeah, be content with what you have. Let's get verse 27 and then maybe summarize both. He who is greedy for gain troubles his own house. He who hates bribes will live. Just this idea of being greedy is going to bring problems. But I'm more interested in verse 16, that better is little with the fear of the Lord. It'd be better to have nothing and have the fear of God in your heart than to have great riches and have no fear. I know of a lot of people that are wealthy, but they have no fear. And I know a lot of people that have fear of God and they have practically nothing to their name. I'd rather be the latter than the former. All right, let's talk about love versus hate. Let's go to verse 17. What do you see in verse 17? It says, better is the dinner of herbs where love is than a fatted calf with hatred. How true. What does it say? Absolutely. Perhaps the focal point is not limited to, but certainly would apply to the family. Would you rather live in a family where everybody there's love of the husband and wife and the parents to the children, children of the parents, there's love and respect, and you're all filled with love, but you sit down and you have to ration the food because you don't have enough food to go around? Or would you rather sit in a wealthy house and a mansion and you have all the food that you want, but there's bickering and fighting and fussing and you don't get along? Not hard to figure that. We don't even need to answer that to understand. Look at verse 18. Let's go to slow to wrath. A wrathful man stirs up strife. This would connect with verse 1, by the way. But he that is slow to anger allays contention. What do you learn? Yeah. Do you try to stop the contention, or you try to make it worse? A wrathful man just stirs up. If we're quick to anger, we're going to stir up more trouble. Slow to anger, patience, contentment is going to calm the situation down. Tie that with verse 1, by the way. Should probably put those two together in that. Let's go to verse 19. Repeatedly throughout the Proverbs is this principle of laziness and slothfulness. The ways of a slothful man is like the hedge of thorns. but the way of the upright is a highway. Now, this one's quite interesting. What do you learn from that? The way of the slothful man, the lazy man, is like a hedge of thorns. Not going to get very far. Going to run into troubles. I think he's focusing on excuses. Some have argued, and I don't think this is the point, though maybe it may be, that the thorn is a plant that promises but doesn't produce. Okay, so the lazy man makes promises, but tomorrow I'm going to get this done, and he never gets things done. You ever do that? You make promises, what I'm going to do? Maybe that's the point. I think perhaps that he's talking about the hedge. The thorns of a hedge were used as fences or boundaries that keep animals from going beyond. And so that's the hindrance to them. So here's this boundary or this fence. So forget hedge and put fence there in your mind, and let's read it again. The way of the slothful man is like a fence. In other words, I would, but he's just made an excuse. He put a fence up. I would have helped you, but, or I was going to get it done, but the reason, and he just put a fence up. The slothful man is always throwing fences up as to why he can't get beyond where he is. That make sense? He makes excuses. If you want to make the application, he makes promises and doesn't produce, then that's true as well. The slothful man is condemned all throughout. Let's talk about wisdom versus foolishness. I'm more interested at verse 20 right here than I am the other verses. Not that they're unimportant. We want to get to this Proverbs 16. Let's look at verse 20. A wise son makes his father glad, but a foolish man despises his mother. What do you get out of that? You use wisdom. A child grows up and they start showing signs of wisdom. What's the father's reaction? He's proud. But the one who rejects wisdom and does foolishness, it's all the same as if he despises his mother. Despises, I don't know, that may mean he despises her personally, but probably more he despises the parental guidance. He disdains the parental guidance, and it's as if he hates his mother. Verse 22, if you don't have a marginal note, we probably did this earlier. 11 and 14, make a marginal note to see 11 and 14. If you weren't here for that, go over to 11 and 14 and put a note, see 15, 22. They say essentially the same. So this talks about counsel versus no counsel. Without counsel, plans go awry. With the multitude of counselors, they are established. What's it saying? Absolutely. The saying is often given, two heads are better than one. So here's what I'm thinking, but you tell me what you're thinking, and let's kind of put our heads together, and that's probably going to be a better plan. Let's incorporate even another one, and so three heads would be better than two. It's that kind of principle. And so when you're trying to make a decision on judgment, what is the best judgment? Seeking advice from others is far better than going on your own. In the multitude of counselors, they are established. Quite often in writing something controversial, I've done this, and in writing some material controversial, submit that to several guys and get their feedback. What do you think? And they give their critical thinking. I wouldn't say this, or I would say that, or I would add this point. That tightens your material much better. I've got better material now because I sought counsel. That's true of all of us. Pride. I want to get verse 33, and then we'll close with verse 30. Verse 33 talks about before honor is humility. Pride, humility brings honor. But I'm interested in this cause of joy. Look at verse 30. The light of the eyes, the light of the eyes rejoices the heart, and a good report makes the bones healthy. Very similar to verse 13. What do you think verse 30 is saying? When you hear good news, just something that just makes you happy. It may be the birth of a child, or the announcement of a birth of a child, or somebody said they're getting married, or someone just announced they're getting a job, or whatever it may be. You heard great news. That news causes inward refreshing that shows outwardly because of that joy. You see it in the beam of their eye. You see it in their countenance. You see it in their facial expression. The light of the eyes rejoices the heart, and a good report makes the bones healthy, makes the bones fat. In other words, there's this inward rejuvenation that comes because of that. All right, questions or comments on 15? Bunch of different stuff here. Miscellaneous psalms thrown together, and we tried to sort them out in categories. And tongue and riches and cheerfulness and laziness and on down the line. Questions or comments? All right, let's go to 16. 16 is much the same. By much the same, it doesn't have the same contrast, but it does have some of the same subjects, such as pride, control of the spirit, righteousness versus wicked, the tongue. The tongue is repeated over and over and over, so it must be something God wanted us to think about. Let's talk about the tongue. I'm going to skip verse 1 because verse 1 may talk about the tongue. The more I study on it, I think it's talking about something else we'll deal with if time permits. Let's look at verse 23. Let's go to verse 13. Let's go to verse 13. It's the next verse on the screen. Let's talk about what we learned from the tongue at verse 13. Righteous lips are delight of the king, and they love him who speaks what is right. What do you learn about the tongue? Context deals with the king, but there's a general principle.
You speak the truth instead of what they want to hear.
All right? That's good. We speak truth instead of what they want to hear. In this context, the king gains respect by the proper use of the tongue. You use your tongue properly, and people will respect the fact that you use your tongue properly. They'll respect you for how you use your tongue, that you're not harsh, you don't answer sharply, that you don't use bad language, etc. Let's look at verse 23. Verse 23, the heart of the wise teaches his mouth and adds learning to his lips. I'm just going to mention that I think he's saying that our words ought to be directed by the Lord. We ought to listen to the word of the Lord. Verse 24, pleasant words are like a honeycomb, sweetness to the soul and health to the bones. What does that mean? Pleasant words are sweet, they're good, they're refreshing. Has anyone ever said something to you and your response to them was, well, thank you, that made my day. That just made my day. It was refreshing, it's encouraging to you. It's pleasant words are sweet and they're good. Look at verse 27. An ungodly man digs up evil and it's on his lips like a burning fire. What does that tell you? Let's get verse 28 with that before you comment. Perverse man sows strife and whispers separates the best of friends. Yeah, he's setting out to do evil. The misuse of the tongue can spread evil. You can destroy a character, you can destroy names, you can destroy a church, destroy a family with your tongue. The tongue is powerful. Look at verse 21. Look at verse 21. The wise in heart will be called prudent, and sweetness of the lips increases learning. What do you make of that? All right? What else do you learn? That's good. The New Century Version says at verse 21, the wise are known for their understanding. Their pleasant words make them better teachers. Perhaps that's what increases learning. Let's see. The New American Standard said the wise in heart will be called understanding, and sweetness of speech increases persuasiveness. How you talk to someone has everything to do with how you persuade them. You may be trying to persuade them to the gospel. You may be trying to persuade them to your way of thinking, or just to get them to do something for you. How you talk, the tone with which you talk, how the words you choose has everything to do with persuasiveness. Tactfully using your tongue has everything to do. Let's talk about our own thinking. Look at verse. Let's go to verse 1 now. Verse 1 is not. I don't list it there, but it should be. The preparation of the heart belongs to the Lord, but the answer of the tongue is from the Lord. What on earth is that about? Verse 9 would fit with that. Man's heart plans his way, but the Lord directs his steps. The preparations of the heart. Well, that's a little confusing to us. The English Standard said the plans of the heart belong to man, but the answer of the tongue belongs to the Lord. The CEV translates that we humans make plans, but the Lord has the final word. I like that. In other words, I've got my own plans, but the Lord is in control, and I think it may have something to do with providence. I'd probably put verse 1 down here. If you're making an outline similar to this, you might put verse 1 down here in that last category as well. That I make my plans, but I don't know for sure what's going to happen because the Lord has the final word. The Lord has the final answer to that. That, I think, is true. Now, verse 9, with that, a man's heart plans his way, but the Lord directs his steps. Verse 25, closely connected. There's a way that seems right to man, but the end's there for the ways of death. Make a marginal note if you don't already have it to see 14 and 12. Says essentially the same thing. There's a way that seems right, but the ends thereof lead to destruction. All right, let's move on to another category. Let's talk about righteousness versus wickedness. I'm more interested in verse 29 here. Let's go to verse 29. A violent man entices his neighbor and leads him in the way that is not good. My pause is for you to explain. What does that mean? Influence, yes. This is talking about influence, is what this is talking about. The influence of the evil person, of the wicked person, they entice others. Look at verse 30. Verse 30 is quite interesting. He winks his eye to devise perverse things. He purses his lips and brings about evil. What's that about? He's up to no good, and it's talking about suspicious behavior. When we're around someone of suspicious behavior, better stay clear. They're probably up to no good. The New Century Version says, someone who winks is planning evil, and one who grins is planning something wrong. You know, if you see in their eye and you see in their grin and you see they're planning something and it's not good, better stay away from them. Again, it's talking about influence, I think, along with verse 29. Let's talk about service to God. Look at verse 7. We're not going to look at every verse, but verse 7. When a man's ways please the Lord, he makes even his enemies be at peace with him. What is that talking about? From verse 3, verse 9, we see the Lord should direct our steps. But verse 7 tells me something about serving the Lord. That when I serve the Lord, it has an impact even on my enemies, my relationships. If it affects my relationship with my enemies, how much more so my service to the Lord is going to affect my relationship with my friends? Would that not be true? It affects our relationships with others. All right, let's move on. Let's talk about riches, verses 8 and 9. 8 and 19, rather. Look at verse 8. Better is little with righteousness than vast revenues without justice. Similar to what we saw earlier, not much comment is needed. Verse 19. Better to be of humble spirit with the lowly than divide the spoil with the proud. Same principle again. It's better to have nothing and serve the Lord than to have riches and have wickedness in our lives. Now, verses 10 to 15 is a unit of verses that deal with the rulers. So let's talk about what we learn about a ruler here. Verse 10, even though divination is on the lips of the king, his mouth must not transgress in judgment. In other words, he ought to speak with fairness and authority and fair and justice is the word I'm looking for. I'm more interested at verse 11. A just weight and balances are the Lord, and all the weights in the bag are his work. What do you learn? How did that applies to all of us, but to the king? Fairness in trade, fairness in business should be directed by the Lord. He should, at verse 13, seek wise counsel. Righteousness are on the lips of the king, and they love him who speaks what is right. He should desire truth and honesty to be spoken to him. I want to drop down now because our time is about gone and notice verse 31, old age. What do you learn about old age? Verse 31, yes. Yeah. A silver head is a crown of glory if it is found in the way of righteousness. Notice the big if. Wisdom, gray hair should signify there's some wisdom here. So you're looking around for somebody that can give you some good judgment. And here's this young person, they may give you good judgment. But the gray-headed person ought to be able to give you good judgment. Is that always true? That may be the worst judgment of all because it's conditioned on maturity. Let's get the wording of the text, verse 31. If it is found in the way of righteousness. So show me a gray-headed person who's been living right and is living right and understands principles of rightness. That will be wisdom. But not everybody who's gray-headed is wise. Old age and wisdom don't always go together, as we know from experience. Now, verse 32. Let's get verse 32 about control of the spirit. He that's slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he who rules his spirit than he who takes a city. What is verse 32 saying? Yeah, you think of an army that comes in and takes a city under its control. I am impressed with the power of how they can come in and get a nation and a city under their control. And you think, man, that's powerful. That's a lot of might. The person who can rein their own spirit in and control their spirit is more impressive than the mighty. Does that make sense? Far more impressive. Yeah, it takes humility to do that. Now let's get to God's providence and we're going to be done. Our time is gone. Look at verse 4. The Lord has made all things for himself. I think that's parallel in principle with Revelation 4 and verse 11, that he made all things for his will. They are and they exist. The Lord has made all things for his use. And that even the wicked for the day of doom. They fit into that plan. I don't think he's saying God made wicked people, made them wicked. But God has a plan and a purpose for them. So there's a plan and a purpose for everything. I don't think that means God wound everything up and then God just unleashed and you have no decisions that you can make. You're not a free moral agent. It just simply means God has created all. That's part of the statement of God's providence. God created all things for his purpose. And then verse 33, to finish that up, the lot is cast into the lap, but every decision is from the Lord. I think that also goes back, I'd put verse 1 in with that. We make our plans, but the Lord has the final say. Make sense? A lot of Proverbs, miscellaneous things thrown together. We're trying to sort them out, make some application of that. All right, chapter 17 and 18 next time.